So good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are welcoming ARI RABIN-HAVT from Washington, D.C. ARI has served as deputy campaign manager on Senator Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign and was a Sanders aide from 2017 to 2021. Prior to working for Sanders, he was host of The Agenda, a national radio show airing daily on Sirius XM. He also served as an advisor to Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid and John Kerry and former Vice President Al Gore. ARI's new book, The Fighting Soul on the Road with Bernie Sanders, is a fabulous book, and this is what it looks like, so you can see it. It is a brilliant, it shows the kind of the brilliance, the dedication and courage that even humor that exemplifies Bernie Sanders is on full display in this book. So I highly recommend that you get a copy. We have it in our local bookstore readers. Between 2017 and 2020, I think no one spent more time with Bernie than ARI RABIN-HAVT, traveling the country for campaign rallies, but also stopping to support striking workers. Bernie's relentless energy, in spite of suffering a heart attack during the campaign, never seemed to diminish. ARI's captures all the reasons why Bernie Sanders is the most loved politician in America today. But we're also going to talk about not just the campaigning with Bernie, but also discuss some of the problems with the Democratic Party and what strategies progressives should consider in future elections. So welcome to Bernie country, ARI. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I wanted to mention something to you that you said you hadn't heard before, and probably most people, if they haven't heard me say it, haven't heard it on this call either. And that is the extraordinary landslide that Bernie caused in the Democratic primary in 2020 in California. He won 53 out of 58 counties in our state. So this is an extraordinary accomplishment. As I told ARI earlier, if we were a country, he would be our president. And it's interesting to me that if Biden had won 53 out of 58 counties, it would have been front page news. But because it was Bernie, it's not even on the back page. So I think this is something all of us should be thinking about and how the media covers our, especially progressives who are running for office. So I have a series of questions, ARI.
But Georgia, can I bring something up here? Because I actually think it is important to what you say.
Great.
To add to that. There are two elements here. One, it was a very specific strategy from the start of the campaign to treat California like an early state. And I do think part of our success was paying attention to California like we paid attention to Iowa and doing it that way. But I think a second thing, and this relates to California, and I think a democracy problem in the state, which is your state doesn't know how to count ballots. Meaning it takes forever to get vote counts in California.
Right.
And I think part of the media problem is it takes forever to get vote counts in California. And there's absolutely no excuse for it. I mean, I happened to be in Hungary for their election, and as undemocratic and insane as that country is, they at least count, actually nobody doubts their ballot counts, and they can count their entire country in one day. In a few hours, and they're paper ballots. There's absolutely no excuse, and it is a huge democracy problem in the state, that it can take weeks to get accurate totals. There's absolutely no reason for it, and it absolutely undermines democracy.
I think that's a really good point. I wonder that every time we have an election, why do we have to wait 1 month for the certification of ballots? And I think part of it is the mail-in ballots, and part of it is the dropped off ballots the day of the election. They don't seem to get counted right away. We should have, I think, a federal way of voting instead of it being every state different. It's definitely a problem. But one of the things I want to get to right away, because it's what just happened, is the Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court and what a disaster this has been. And I want to know if you favor, and also if Bernie favors, expanding the Supreme Court. Because it seems like if we don't add more people to it, we're looking at a right-wing strike down one after another until we have a full authoritarian regime. So I'd like your thoughts on it and also what you think Bernie feels about expanding the Supreme Court.
I actually don't know how Bernie feels about expanding the Supreme Court. I'd imagine he would be very cautious about it, but ultimately favor whatever leads to more democracy, which is kind of the frame he operates out of. But he is cautious about, he tends to be slightly cautious about changes to democratic and even undemocratic processes. I think we have, regardless of the solution, the Supreme Court has a huge problem. I mean, historically, what we should note is the Supreme Court is the only branch of the federal government to bequeath itself its own power. Meaning, the Supreme Court wasn't given power of judicial review. It took it. And it took it in the case of Marbury Madison, right? And Congress can regulate the court. And essentially, Congress should, at this point, if we had a functional democracy, would step in and regulate the court and deem, conservatives, and this is something that a lot of people haven't realized, what they've done to slowly erode a lot of power in criminal justice is they've inserted in statutes, in particular related to some criminal justice issues, the stripping jurisdiction away from the federal courts of certain aspects they don't want reviewed. They've done that actually repeatedly in law over the past few decades. And that shows they see a problem for themselves and have kind of used their power in the legislature to take advantage of it. I think the main problem is, as an institution, the Supreme Court is a completely corrupted institution. It has for, since it's, for 200 years, this isn't a new phenomenon, existed to protect the powerful and except for a few situations, really enshrine discrimination in a number of cases, enshrine some awful decisions, dating back to Plessy, dating all the way back. And I think we do have a Supreme Court problem, and whether it is by, expansion of the court, stripping away the idea of some of the court's powers, which I think is something that really hasn't gotten talked about, but something Congress can do. Term limits on Supreme Court justices, meaning it's not a lifetime appointment. It is a 14-year appointment, a 12-year appointment. So you have some rotating powers. I mean, the biggest problem we have with our court today is the undemocratic nature of our presidential electoral system. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the justices that voted to overturn Roe, most of them were appointed by presidents not elected with even a plurality of the vote, and were confirmed by senators, a bunch of them who did not have the support of a plurality of the American people, meaning if you added up all the people in their states, they didn't. The fact that somebody in Wyoming has 43 times the power of the Supreme Court over somebody in California in terms of the Senate is insane. Mm-hmm. So we have a democracy problem that extends beyond the Supreme Court, and we need to deal with that fundamental democracy problem. It's not just expanding the court, it's actually figuring out what is wrong with our democracy, where you're in California, which is the most democratically oppressed state in terms of the Senate.
Good point. Yes, we are.
That it's, for some reason, not for some reason, we all know the reasons, we decided that land should have more democracy than people.
things before people, which brings me to something else I'd like to talk about. This is the high-tech libertarians, the billionaires financing right-wing candidates and policies, but also their latest strategy, which is recall elections. Since they can't win at the ballot box, they're starting to try and recall. They tried with our governor. They managed to succeed in San Francisco with Chesa Boudin, who is the district attorney. And this seems to be their strategy now, since they can't, if they can't win at the ballot box, they're going to be taking on recall elections. How do you think we should address this? How can we combat it? What should we do?
It's an interesting problem. I mean, California has gone through an insane amount of kind of bad democracy experimentation. Leading back, I remember, to go back, Prop 103 and kind of the proposition system that over a variety of propositions almost locked California into terrible budgeting procedures, terrible law, etc. You have, and by the way, the problem is big money spends unlimited amounts. I know political consultants who work on the California, just work on California propositions, and they earn more than people who work on presidential campaigns or super PACs. Like that's the largest amount of money I've ever seen spent in elections tends to be on California propositions. I think the problem with recalls is you just have to win them. Presumably they should be good for democracy. I think how California does them can get very confusing. As I understand it, you know, the way the governor's recall gets done is you have to vote no, and then the candidates immediately go into a race, so it's not separated, which I think is a crazy way to make voters have to think about it, and that should probably be reformed. Fundamentally, I don't oppose the idea of recalls, because I like the idea that voters can have the chance to say, you're doing a terrible job, you don't deserve to be there. But I think we should have a very high bar for it. And I think the problem with our democracy is not that recall elections exist. It's going back to the Gray Davis recall. You know, Darrell Issa, who I think people remember this history, who decided he wanted to recall the governor and spent millions of his own money, which he earned from a car alarm company, after being, you know, after there's somewhat of a shady history with car thefts there with Darrell Issa that people can read about. But, you know, earned hundreds of millions of dollars with this car alarm company and used it to get elected to Congress and finance a recall that then when Arnold Schwarzenegger ran, he started crying because he couldn't be governor. He couldn't buy his way into the governor's mansion. I think the problem comes down to we value money over voters, not that voters, if voters had an opportunity to do that and it was a real opportunity for voters, that's good. The problem is money overwhelms the system.
Yes, that is the problem. I have several other questions and I'm going to try to just go to some of the ones that I think might be more important. But one is about what do you expect to come out of the January 6th committee hearings? And do you think there's any influence that people in Congress can exert over what happens?
I mean, I have a very low opinion of what I think the hearings have been much better than I thought in terms of how they've been managed. I think it hasn't been the standard, like, let's do 30 minutes of like boring speeches. I think they have been very well done. Let's start with that like in terms of how these hearings have like explored January 6th, they have, to me, as somebody who's been around Congress for 2 decades, really exceeded expectations and have kind of shown the best of Congress does have this investigatory power and kind of how to wield it. I have very little faith that but Congress isn't a prosecutor. Congress is a legislative body. The Justice Department is a prosecutor. Congress has already taken the action. The House of Representatives, I should say, has already taken the action about January 6th that they are permitted under the Constitution to take against Donald Trump. They impeached him. That is the power of Congress. And look, I think January 6th for me, and I write a little bit about it in the book. Look, that day, I was on Capitol Hill. It was an incredibly personally traumatic experience. I've been on Capitol Hill for 2 terrorist attacks, 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, which happened kind of back to back. I've been in high security areas. I've been in places where shots are being fired in my life. And I have never been as personally frightened for my personal safety as I was during the January 6th incident. My basic story was I was on the House side and doing something, and the shelter in place call went out, and I was not in the place you could shelter in place. And I was told to leave that place. So now I'm kind of a Senate staffer on the House side with no place to shelter in place. I ended up going to the entrance. There are 2 tunnels connecting the House office buildings to the Capitol. And I end up going to one of those entrances, which is in a building called RABIN, because I figured there were police there. The police were there. They said, yeah, hang out right at this entrance. We'll be good. About 5 minutes after I got there, Nancy Pelosi gets escorted out. And when I say escorted, I mean men with automatic weapons literally carrying her through the tunnel, running as fast as possible out. Then you saw Republican leadership, kind of the same thing. And we're sitting there, and then there was the call of shots fired over the police intercoms. There was a shots fired call, which is when the woman was killed in the House side. But there was really no information. I just heard the police radio constantly and the calls back and forth. Suddenly a group of police officers, Capitol Police, dressed in riot gear, came through the tunnel towards us. Several were injured. One was bleeding from his head. They had clearly been exposed to chemical sprays and were clearly impacted by that. And they were fleeing the Capitol. There's no way around that. And they were like, it's not safe. Get out of here. Go, go, go into the building. So I kind of went into the building. There's a set of escalators which go into the Longworth building, and then a tunnel into Cannon. And you pass this cafeteria, the Longworth cafeteria on your right, and it's a bank of elevators. I come up that elevator. As I get to, there's a bank, there's the Congressional Credit Union there. As you enter the tunnel as you enter the kind of entrance into Cannon that has another tunnel into the Capitol. As I entered that kind of area between the Longworth building and the Cannon building, another set of armor-clad police officers come running towards us. They were like, not safe, not safe, not safe. Go that way. Go, 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 go. I said, where should I shelter? They're like, anywhere. Just go lock yourself in a room. I ran back to RABIN. And RABIN is, because I figured RABIN is like a cavernous building.
Yeah, I've been in it.
With numerous, the other buildings are kind of like Longworth is kind of a trapezoid. Cannon is a square. RABIN is this weirdly maze-like building, which is good for, which I figured was better to hide. I went to the middle floor, the 3rd floor, because I figured if people came in, they would go to the top floor or the bottom floor. So I went to the middle floor. I went to a committee room, and I literally barricaded myself with furniture inside a committee room. I was there for a little bit. My phone was dying. I had no communication, no idea of what was going on. I started calling around to people to see if they were in their offices. I texted Congressman Ro Khanna. He was like, if you can get to my office, it's in Cannon. There are people there, go there. But I didn't know if I could make it to Cannon. I finally connected with Pramila Jayapal's office, which was close to where I was. So I kind of ran there through the hallway and ended up within their office for a number of hours until we were told we could go back. I could go back across the Senate side by the police, which was literally 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Went back to the Senate side. Bernie was in the office alone because what ended up happening was there were only 4 or 5 staff in the office because of COVID and a bunch of other restrictions. And when on the Senate side, it was evacuate. So they followed instructions and evacuated. Bernie's, the staffer who's kind of in the Senate, known as a body man, always with Bernie. When they evacuated Bernie out of the chamber with the other senators, they made him stay behind. He ended up locked in Chuck Schumer's office, and which is off the Senate floor. And he heard the protesters banging on the door. And look, this was a young, in his early 20s, African-American guy who would have been an easy target for these protesters. He literally ran out of the Capitol and ran home when he could get out. So I ended up with Bernie till about 1:30 a.m. We walked through the Capitol at one point, and when people say this was nothing, this was not an attack, that it really is BS. Like, it really, you walk through the building and you just saw the entire floor of the first floor of the Capitol just covered in shards of glass, chemical spray everywhere, evidence of blood just everywhere. And it wasn't like one area. Like, I've seen windows broken at the Capitol before, but this was like desks upturned. The parliamentarian's office, who I have my own negative opinions of the parliamentarian, but certainly don't want to see her office sacked. And it was literally sacked. I think that day profoundly impacted me. I think what the hearings have done is done a really great job showing that this wasn't an isolated thing, that this was a planned out portion. What don't I have faith in? I don't have faith that the Justice Department will do anything about it.
That's
I think with these prosecutions, I just don't have faith that Garland has shown. Like, I'd like to be surprised, but throughout his entire career, he has never shown himself to be one who pushes boundaries. And anything here does push kind of precedent and boundaries, but it is a moment that deserves to push those boundaries. It was a moment where our democracy was literally in peril. And the idea that this wasn't an attack on our Capitol just doesn't jive with the experience of people like me who were there that day.
You know, I'm very glad that you spoke about this. I didn't realize how involved you were that day. One of the things that people have talked about is if they aren't held accountable, Trump and the people who supported this attempted coup are not held accountable, that it makes people more cynical, less likely to go vote, especially young people. I think, you know, in Sonoma County in 2008, when we elected Obama, we had an incredible turnout, the highest we'd ever had in our county before then and after then. We had a 93% turnout. We've never had that again, but that was because people were so energized. But they've lost a lot of that energized, you know, through Bernie being sideswiped in the Democratic Party in the primaries, through the cynicism that you're talking about if nothing happens with these perpetrators of an attempted coup.
Well,
and the cynicism gets even stronger in the populace, especially with young people.
I think there's a general, like, you started with the Supreme Court, and we can talk about the Senate, but I think the biggest problem is we are constantly told that nothing can happen because of the process. We can't do X because of the parliamentarian. We can't do Y because we need 60 votes. What if we had 60 votes, we'd be told we need 63 votes. If we had 63 votes, if we only had one more vote. And the problem with that is, and I think the whole vote harder line, like, yes, we should vote. Everybody should vote. Like, and generally, the Democratic candidate will be the best candidate to vote for in general. I live in a place where my vote really doesn't matter. Like Washington, D.C., where, we don't like, I guess you could say, I just get to cast a vote in the one election where my vote does matter, which is our mayor and city council member, the Democratic primary, I should say, for our mayor and city council member, because whoever wins the Democratic primary wins the election in the city. This is a city that's 90% Democrat in terms of voting populace. But we tell people we tell people they have to vote, and then our leaders consistently behave in a way where they're telling people, you have to vote harder, every election is the most important, and then your vote doesn't matter because the unelected parliamentarian, who literally is just and we could talk about this, is just a Senate staffer, is not a constitutional officer, is just a staffer who can be fired by the majority leader and has been fired on numerous, the parliamentarian has been fired on numerous occasions for not making decisions in line with what the majority leader wants. You know, because they made a decision, we can't have minimum wage. Because of the filibuster, we can't win. Look, the truth is, like, you look at today's Supreme Court ruling, and there is no excuse for the fact that in 2009, Democrats with 60 votes in the Senate could have made Roe v. Wade law.
This is why people get cynical.
And they could have done it. It's a simple vote. It's not a court, you know, abortion is legal. It can be law. Right. And then, I've heard people arguing against filibuster reform by saying, well, then if we have filibuster reform, if Democrats take control, we'll have one set of laws. And if Republicans take control, we'll have a second set of laws. And my response is, that's great. You know why? Because it tells people your vote matters. If you vote, like, you better vote because your vote counts. If you don't vote, and if you vote wrong, yeah, elections have consequences. Instead, our elections have consequences. There are consequences. But, I think our fundamental systems just don't handle change as well as a lot of parliamentary systems. And therefore we operate on, our let's use tech bro talk. We operate on a source code that's 200 years old. Great. And it doesn't work there's no piece of machinery that you would use from 200 years ago that you would suggest is more efficient than a piece of machinery you use today. Great. Yet, democracy operates on machinery from 200 years ago.
I could go off on a whole other direction with that, but I won't, because I know people want to ask questions, but that would bring me to ask you about a constitutional convention, which I know a lot of people on the left oppose, but we won't get into that right now. What I wanted to ask you before we start with the questions from the audience is, this will get more on an upbeat note, what was your most memorable or interesting day on the campaign trail with Bernie in 2020?
The last day?
Not the last day was?
Yeah. Okay. The last day of campaigning, March 10th, where, COVID shut down after. It kind of bookends two moments that really speak to something about Bernie and who he is beyond a politician. So it starts, and I discuss this in the book a little bit. If we go back to the Detroit debate at the end of July, we're in the green room. Faz Shakir, the campaign manager, myself and Bernie are the only three people in this tiny little green room in this theater in Detroit. And Bernie looks dour and down and low energy. And we're in a discussion, me, Faz, Jeff Weaver, and I, another longtime Bernie Sanders aide, are texting each other, being like, what should we do? John Delaney, who was this kind of weird candidate who was a member of Congress who ran, who nobody cared about, released a press release basically saying he was going to call Bernie a communist on stage. Jeff texts us, says, read him the press release. What? Jeff's like, read him the press release. So Faz reads him the press release. Bernie turns to us and goes, you know what my favorite song was as a kid? The Charlie Brown song. Why is everybody always picking on me? And Faz pulled up the song on his iPhone and started playing it. And Bernie starts dancing around the green room and just gets this like huge burst of energy. And he's like shadow boxing, and like this song completely energizes him in this moment. And he walks out on stage, and that was the I wrote the damn bill debate. That was his kind of best debate performance. He was like, he was just punching back at everybody. He was brilliant in that debate.
Right, I remember.
To the end of the last day, we were in Detroit. We were supposed to fly to Ohio for like the kind of election night rally in Ohio, which was kind of in the next tranche of states up for primaries. And it was very clear the world was shutting down. We were unclear about whether we should have rallies. We were consulting with public health officials. There were rumors that Ohio was going to shut down public events in the state. We we were soliciting guidance on what we should do. So we kind of had like 3 hours where there really was nothing going on, which kind of a first in the campaign, where we were trying to figure out what we would do. And Bernie was like, let's go to the Henry Ford Museum. And so we drove to the Henry Ford Museum, which if any of you have been to, despite its namesake, who obviously was Nazi sympathizer, et cetera, is actually a wonderful museum of American history with like just so many like artifacts of American history in the museum, from like George Washington's tent from the Revolutionary War, the limousine that JFK was in, like just it's pretty much like this. And we were there and literally didn't announce, we just showed up. The museum was like an open museum. They were like, uh-oh, they like ran out to like give him a tour. Then we finished that and Bernie was like, where can we go next? And I said, we go to the Motown Museum. So we drive to downtown Detroit to this townhouse, which was the original headquarters of Motown. And Bernie was, I go back to that moment, he gets into the Motown Museum and he is so excited. He knows every record, every song, every artist he's going through, in the kind of final moment of the campaign almost. And I have a picture of this. If you have my book,
Yeah.
I have a picture of this in the photo section of the book that I took. The final stop on the tour is the original Motown recording studio. And he and the tour guide, and he sat in the studio and duetted on My Girl in the studio. And it was the only time he's ever been like, Ari, take my picture. One of 2 times he was like, Ari, take my picture on the campaign in the Motown recording studio, which truly was the place that like brought him back to like who he is beyond a politician. Like he's that kid listening to like the music of his youth was Motown. That was his childhood. And that was kind of one of the more interesting moments of the campaign to share.
Great. It's really nice to hear about that. I liked reading about it in the book. I mean, there's some wonderful moments in the book, which I would recommend to everybody again. In fact, I just had seen it at the bookstore and I thought, oh my God, I didn't know about this book. How come I didn't know about it? And I bought it immediately, read it, and then thought we've got to have you at one of our events. So now I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. And when I call on you, you can unmute. Otherwise, probably it's a good idea to stay mute. It always takes a minute or so before people are anxious to ask. If they don't, I've got a whole bunch more.
Georgia.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Julie, and I would just like to say thank you very much for recounting your experience on the day of those riots. I don't know what else to call them. I've never heard anyone explain how it impacted them, and I really appreciate hearing that. And I'm sorry you had to experience it.
Well, I'm more sorry our country had to experience it because.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we all are shocked about it. Anyone with a question? This is unusual. Linda, you're usually full of questions. Okay, Bob, go ahead. You want to unmute?
Let me get off. Yep. So I understand your points on the electoral system. I share them. What are your suggestions on what we could do about that? Obviously, it would take an act of something to actually get rid of the electoral college, but what about some other ways to reform?
Well, look, I think there's an easy form to the electoral college, which is becoming shockingly successful, and we're edging closer to it, which is an interstate compact where a bunch of states have basically said, when we get to 270 electoral votes, states that equal 270 electoral votes, our electors will go to the winner of the popular vote. Meaning, if we can get a group of states together that equal 270 plus 1, they will just give their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. Because states can dictate any way they want to give out their electors. And that is coming closer and closer to fruition, with more and more states joining that. So that would be the easiest reform to that. But I don't think that gets us where we need to be. Look, I think the Senate as an institution, more than any other, needs a ridiculous quantity of reform. And the thing is, the only requirement for anything in the Senate, as somebody who knows Senate rules backwards and forwards, the truth is, with 50 votes and no shame, you can do whatever you want in the Senate. And we need Democrats to recognize that an anti-majoritarian body needs reform. And reforming our Constitution it's frankly too high a bar. It doesn't, constitutional amendments require such a huge lift that I don't believe without a significant change in our populace that is feasible. But we do have, the Senate has huge paths to reform and has done it in the past and only needs a majority to do it. We've had, what is it, 4 reforms of Senate rules by majority vote since 2000. Since Harry Reid did it, we've had, I think, 4 rounds of reforms in the nominating and judicial process by majority vote. And I think it's time we do that. If you want to like exemplar of how broken our Senate is, the majority of votes we send lawmakers to Washington, the majority of votes in the Senate in the last 2 years, and I think it's probably like 2/3 of the votes are spent, and 2/3 of the time are spent on sub-cabinet nominees. Does anybody really think it is valuable for Senate to be spending 3 votes, and it takes 3 votes often to confirm people, and an intervening day and 30 hours of debate? Actually, it's less now. It's been shrunk because of one of the changes to 2 hours of debate, but the like a whole bunch of different qualifications to confirm the general counsel at the Department of Health and Human Services. Is that worth our democracy's time? And the issue is, you have so much you can fix in the Senate, from our nominating process to different ways of reforming the filibuster. And there are a few separate ideas to reestablishing the concept of a talking filibuster because I don't think people recognize how easy it is to block a bill in the Senate. Let me tell you how you block a bill in the Senate. Ready? I, as a staff member, don't like something in a piece of legislation. Without calling my boss, I can just call the cloakroom and say, now my boss better get my back in the kind of back end of this, but I can just call the cloakroom and say, Bernie Sanders wants a callback, not even a hold. I'd like a callback on S-243. And that means before they brought up that bill to the floor or did anything, the cloakroom has to call me back and get my permission.
Wow.
As a staffer.
So anything can be stopped that way.
And it's called a hold. Technically, that's how a hold works. But yeah, and a lot of and all a hold is a threat to filibuster. Now, there is legislation that they'll say, okay, you threat to filibuster, go for it. We don't care, right? And that's big legislation. But the amount of small legislation that gets held up that way is incredible. And you essentially need, without unanimous consent, the chamber doesn't work. So there was when Tom Coburn was a senator, at one point during the Obama years, there was a bill known as the Coburnibus. And it was a bunch of bills that he had just filibustered that everybody else had agreed to. And they literally had to spend 2 weeks passing. They just combined all these bills into one bill that were totally uncontroversial, just because he wanted to hold them up that needed to get done. Like that system and that process is so broken that the Senate needs a full slate of reforms.
Could the Senate reform the representation system? You know, like you contrasted,
No, that's constitutional. So you'd need a constitutional amendment.
so there would be no other way around that one.
No, that, you know, every state gets 2 senators is a constitutional amendment.
Okay. And any thoughts on Sinema and Manchin and any way of dealing with them or not?
Yeah, look, I think there's a difference between the two of them. The problem with Manchin is he does exactly what he says, which is like Manchin doesn't like, there's no kind, like, it sucks, but you kind of just have to listen to him. And he does what he says. He doesn't, and in some ways I respect that, because there are probably 10 senators who like what he does, who just hide behind him. But he just does what he says. Sinema is an interesting problem because she's more of an enigma. She doesn't say anything. So therefore you kind of just never know where she's going to come in and block you. I would say this, looking back, there are 2 moments in the last year that really I have questions about decisions made by leadership. One, I explicitly raised with them at the time they made the decision. And the other happened after I had left the office, or became public. It happened and then became public months later after I left the office. The first was on the second reconciliation package that had all the stuff in it. We passed the first one, that was great. On the second one, I don't understand why Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer didn't take the gift that McConnell had given them. And what I mean by that is, so McConnell had said, I'm not going to let Republicans will not supply a single vote to raise the debt ceiling. And if Democrats want to raise the debt ceiling, they should just do it in reconciliation and get it done. Now, the truth is the debt ceiling is a stupid vote that nobody gives a crap about, electoral wise. And people just demagogue it with nobody actually caring about the demagoguing except for some media people in DC. For some reason, Schumer, Pelosi, and Biden, which I still can't understand, I think because they're trapped in kind of a 90s mentality with this, were like, Republicans are being hypocrites. They passed the debt ceiling under Trump, and now they have to do it under Biden. But nobody actually cares about that. We're not going to do it in reconciliation. But had Schumer just said, so at the time, the Treasury Department was saying August was the deadline. It got kicked to October, but they were saying August was the deadline. If I were Schumer, and when we raise this, like, why not just say, look, McConnell's put us in a box. We now have a deadline, because you can raise the debt ceiling in reconciliation. That's long precedent, so there's no problem actually doing that. We have to raise the debt ceiling in reconciliation, so we have to get a reconciliation bill done by the time we leave for August recess. We have this deadline. And let me tell you, the 2 most motivating factors in the United States Congress are deadlines and jet fumes at National Airport. There's not, and so you would have been able to line up both those things, right? You guys aren't going to get to go home for August recess, and we need to pass this. And everybody knows we need to pass the debt ceiling. And look, Manchin and Sinema, they mess around with a lot of things, but they're not messing around with the debt ceiling vote. They just aren't. Like those 2, they're just not doing that. And then you could have engaged in a much more serious form of negotiation with a hard deadline, and something would have gotten done. Would it have been the $3 trillion bill? Unlikely. I think you would have ended up with a $1.5 to $1.6 trillion bill. You would have been able to continue the child tax credit. You would have been able to do some other things, and the world would have continued on, right? And then Biden wouldn't be caught in the morose of a DC negotiation that dragged on forever and made him seem weak and powerless. And frankly, I think that's what shrunk his approval ratings.
I agree.
You got into a period where he just seemed feckless.
Yeah.
And whether he was or not, he seemed that way, which is actually more important because that's just an image thing.
Mhm.
That was decision number 1. Decision number 2 was in August. Manchin goes to Schumer and says, the cap on the debt ceiling, the reconciliation bill, I'm due 1.7 trillion. And him and Schumer signed a piece of paper. And then they didn't tell anybody. And the staff working on the reconciliation bill kept working on a $3 trillion bill. The senators, the House, everybody had 3 trillion. I don't understand why Schumer didn't go to everybody and be like, look, Manchin set the cap at 1.7. We got to do that. Sorry.
Yeah, that was an amazing.
And hid it from everybody. And so we were fake negotiating.
Yeah,
Right? There wasn't real. And I don't understand those two moments.
Well, when you said that they're still thinking in the 90s, I think that's a very interesting point. And a lot of times they're fighting the progressives, which is unbelievable to me. But I want to go to a question from Mike. Mike,
Hey,
you're
Mike.
Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks for everything you shared. No, I never heard anybody personally like you did on a format like this explain what happened there, but I have heard a lot of accounts from a lot of different people and just different things I've seen. Some of the cops that were there and different people said a lot of incredible things. Not to mention
And the cops there and people in the building, by the way, went through unique hells. Like there's a New York Times photographer, Erin, who is one of the best photographers in the world, who got pushed down and had her camera stolen and was hurt, was physically injured. Like people went through a lot worse than me. And I do want to say that.
Thanks. You know, I guess one of the things that I want to ask somebody like you who's knowledgeable is of all the things that need to be worked on, you know, the Supreme Court. Okay, you talk about the Supreme Court. Just kind of let me finish the question train of thought. You got what's happening with guns. You got the Supreme Court. I'm born and raised in New Hampshire. New Hampshire should not have 2 senators, okay? Like California has 2 senators, it shouldn't be. And so that's just an example of what you were saying. There's no way in hell that should be. And then you got the Electoral College. It's total insanity. But the courts, the Supreme Court, it just, I mean, no more abortion rights. The whole gun thing, we're supposed to pass some gun bills. And they now say, it just happened the other day, everybody can carry a gun. You walk around with a gun on your holster, like the Western days. I know some states are fighting it, but the Supreme Court said it's okay everybody should have a gun because the Second Amendment says you should have a gun, okay? And also, by the way, it just happened, I think, yesterday, the cops don't have to give you your Miranda rights anymore. They don't have to tell you, you know, what you say can be held, you know, blah, 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 blah. You can get a lawyer. Supposedly, they don't have to say that anymore. They're not held accountable. But the question I want to ask is, of all and then Trump is going to run again in 2024. I swear to God, if that happens, I swear to God, I'm going to go punch him out. Okay. And I haven't punched anybody since I was about in the 5th grade. But, you know, it's insanity to me that to even consider that man would be able to run again after what's happening, what's coming out after these hearings. So where do we human, you know, just regular people put their energy of all these different things that are happening? To me, I think about the most important thing is that Trump should not be allowed to run again, but maybe that's not the most important thing. I don't know. But Electoral College, Supreme Court for life, look at the people that are on it. I can't even look at them. So, I mean, where do you begin? What would create the biggest change to really put your energy of all these different issues that are going on all at the same time over the next 2 years?
Yeah, I think that is one of the more difficult questions. I think in a lot of ways, the problem is there isn't one answer and the political system doesn't. And in a lot of ways, the political system isn't like 2 years is not a big enough time frame. Like if you're saying what will make the biggest dent in the next 2 years, well, it's not that I'm worried about Trump. Like I'm less concerned about Trump, not that I want him to run again, than I am about the kind of Trumps without the stupidity of Trump. I'm more concerned about, I look at Hungary, where I have a lot of friends and I've spent some time there. I look at Hungary and I look at a leader like Viktor Orban, who is Trump, but intelligent, who is Trump, but is Trump, but incredible political skills. And you know, you have a country now where, do you know the one thing worse than oligarchs controlling the government? There's government controlling the oligarchs. And that's literally what happens in Hungary. And what I mean is the way it works in Hungary literally is Orban has a set of oligarchs and he decides who the rich people are going to be. And they're the rich people. And there was the richest man in Hungary. And then he went on the radio and insulted Orban. You can read about this, by the way, if you want to. He went on the radio. He said some things that probably should not be repeated. I think your call would not appreciate the language used for what this guy said. And then he wasn't the richest man in Hungary anymore. And now the richest man in Hungary is a guy named Mészáros, who was literally the gas meter reader in Orban's hometown, is now the wealthiest man in Hungary. And how does it work? I'll give you an example of how it works. So there was a power plant, and I'm kind of oversimplifying, but this is basically what happened. There was a power plant. It was a very dirty coal power plant. And Orban said the state has to sell the power plant. So they sold it to Mészáros and a few of his cronies for 10 billion forints, because it's an EU country, but it's not on the euro. It's on its currency called the forint. And he sold it for 10 billion forints to Mészáros and some partners. And then the partners went away. And about a few months later, like 6 months or 8 months later, Orban was like, the EU, the bureaucrats in Brussels are saying we have to clean up our dirty air. That power plant's the dirtiest power plant. We got this money from Brussels to clean up our air. We have to shut down that power plant. So I have to buy it back for the state. And so we bought it back for 30 billion forints.
Oh,
So
interesting.
his buddy pocketed 20 billion forints.
Yeah.
Now, what is Mészáros? Now, this happens over and over again, road projects. Basically, the EU pumps in money, and then Orban figures out ways to steal the money.
Yeah, you know, it reminds me of a serial I just started watching called the what is it? Man of the People. Yeah, I forgot what. Oh, Servant of the People. And Zelensky is the star of it, and he's the president of Ukraine. And it was made 4 years before he became president of Ukraine. So it's bizarre.
But this is the end. Why? So what Orban does though is he has a set of oligarchs. So they then go and buy up the media in the country.
Right.
And so now all the media is controlled by oligarchs who are dependent on Orban for their wealth. So what does that media become? It becomes propaganda media to service Orban.
It's like everybody's Fox News.
Worse than Fox News, if you can imagine, complete state propaganda.
Right.
And it goes as far as literally most of the billboards in the country are controlled by Orban's cronies. So if you're in the opposition, you can't, it's not that you're not allowed to buy billboards. There's free speech, but nobody's going to sell you. There's like 10% of billboards in the country they'll sell you if you're in the worst locations. And the biggest billboards in the country, when I was there a year ago now, literally half the billboards in the country were just attacks on George Soros. And then when I was there before the election, half the billboards were attacks on the opposition. The billboards actually owned by the state were either anti-gay billboards, these were the state-owned ones, or billboards of a picture of Orban looking like a military general, almost not in the military uniform, but almost looking like very generally would be the way to put it. And then the line was, he protects the peace. He keeps the peace. This is literally right before an election. And half the billboards, not half the political billboards, like half the toothpaste, toilet paper, Orban. And so, yeah, the opposition could get 2 or 3 billboards here and there, but they can't control. The state TV network has to, by law in Hungary, give 5 minutes to the opposition. Not 5 minutes a day, 5 minutes during the election period.
The whole period.
The whole period. The Independence Day in Hungary is March 15th, which is a big day of political rallies and other things. They called the opposition campaign on literally like March 13th or 14th and said, okay, you have 5 minutes at 10 a.m. on March 16th.
Oh, yeah, amazing.
So 10 a.m. the day after. And then, by the way, the hour before the opposition, was Orban's entire Independence Day speech, and the hour after was Orban's entire Independence Day speech. So what I worry about, like there is something worse, oddly, than our system, which is the oligarchs, the government controlling the oligarchs.
Yeah, that's an
Which is
interesting
more
one.
like, which is more the Russian model and the Hungarian model.
We have a few questions and I know we're running out of time, so I don't know what your time frame is, Ari. I've got 3 people who want to ask
So
questions.
let's do these 3 questions and then we can sign up.
Okay, let's make your questions really succinct. I'm going to ask all 3 of you to make them succinct and to the point. So Lori, I'm going to call on you first.
Okay. I basically just, I admire you so much for your candor, your honesty, and your ethics. I just wanted to state that, you know, given a lot of this January 6th comment, okay, and congressional committee and what we see going forward, it's having the presence of mind to really have a code of ethics. I know that Senator Bernie is also a very ethical individual, but what is it like being an ethical individual in the midst of all that's going on in Washington, D.C.?
Good.
I too had to take an oath and swore to defend the Constitution. So I just want to say, I understand that statement.
Washington, especially on the Hill, is this place where there is a natural process of sucking your values out of you, and it is very difficult to resist. I'll do it from a staffer perspective because that's my perspective, but it also happens to members for a number of senators and members of the House, same thing. So you start on the Hill, you're a staff assistant. You answer the phone, you get flag requests, you give tours. You're not doing anything policy related, but you're serving your thing and you're like, this is great. And if you disagree with your boss on something, that's fine because you're just kind of serving the country. There's no thing. Then you become a legislative correspondent, and your job is to answer all the constituent mail that comes into the office. And when you take that job, there's a moment where, so my job as an LC was for a member named Ted Strickland, who was 100% pro-union, like very pro-labor in a district that is now hugely Trump country. It's Eastern Ohio, kind of from Steubenville all the way down Ohio. So where all the steel mills closed and that. But he was also very, very pro-gun. And this is 2003, 2001, 2002, very pro-gun. And I'm not. And I had to answer constituent mail that is very pro-gun for Ted Strickland, and so you have to kind of sacrifice a bit of your soul to answer that, right? Because you're saying I'm here for a bigger cause, so I do that. Then you become a legislative assistant or a press, or you do press and comms, and now you have to represent your boss on issues where you disagree. And slowly over time, a lot of people in DC, it's very easy to just lose yourself completely because you're always kind of serving the interests of yourself and not your boss. And there's nobody you're ever going to agree with 100% of the time. And I think it is very difficult in the midst of a city that strives on the perception of power to lose yourself in that world and consider and think about power as more important than ideology. And I think it is very difficult to get lost in it. And I think everybody does at some point in DC. And the question is, can you recognize that power and fame are both fleeting, kind of silly, and meaningless when it comes down to it?
This is why we left Bernie, Ari. This is clearly why. And the questioner was our former mayor, Lori. So I'm going to go to Howard now.
Okay, I just finished looking up the word succinct, and I'll do my best. I think probably in a lot of dictionaries, when you look up the word iconoclast, you'll see Bernie's picture next to it. But my question is looking at the big picture. How do you think that history will judge Bernie's contributions to American history? But before you answer that, let me just seed it with a a counter argument. Can't you argue that he served as a foil for the right, as a caricature of the as a caricature of the radical left, and in so doing strengthened the radical right? So how will history judge him?
Look, I've heard that criticism. I very much disagree with it. I think he will get judged. I think there are a few people who have lost the presidential race in history who have really influenced politics and really changed primarily their own parties moving forward. And it doesn't mean they won immediately, and those changes are hard to see in the immediate intervening years, but what they did was influence another generation moving forward. So you look at the Republican Party, you don't get Ronald Reagan in 1980 without Barry Goldwater in 1964. And interveningly, you had Nixon, who, while a conservative, et cetera, enacted, frankly, oddly, some of the most liberal legislation of the past 50 years. But you don't get the conservatism of Ronald Reagan without Barry Goldwater's 64 campaign. You don't get a lot of what the Democratic Party ended up becoming under Franklin Roosevelt without 1912 Theodore Roosevelt. With the Bull Moose Party of 1912. You don't get a lot of what the Democratic Party became without William Jennings Bryan's failed campaigns. And I think there have been those who, and I think ultimately what you will see is Bernie will have that influence over the Democratic Party. To the caricature question, look, the Republicans are going to caricature every Democrat. And frankly, I think that's why it doesn't work anymore. It's, John Kerry was a communist, right? According to the Republican Party. And I think we all know John Kerry's a lot of things, but a man of certitude and moral fiber in his later political career. His early political career, much more, but in his presidential run, certainly that wasn't his, he wasn't a communist. I don't think the fact, Joe Biden's a communist. Like they've just tried to caricature every Democrat. Barack Obama was every Democrat got caricatured. And I think the truth is Bernie has constantly shown, oddly, a willingness to step in to very conservative atmospheres and always come out ahead in those confrontations. So be it going on Fox News at the height of the campaign and doing a town hall where, I don't know if people remember, but Brett Baer was like, how many of you would give up your private insurance for this socialist thing? And the entire hall was like, yeah, good deal. Well, and there was shock on this Fox News town hall. It's like, yeah, we'd gladly give up our private insurance for
Right, I remember that surprise. One of the things I think that Bernie was so strong with too, is you couldn't, the right couldn't label him a socialist because he would say, yes, I'm a democratic socialist. He never was in a position of reaction. He was
and they'll label him a socialist anyway. And look, there is some character there. And there are voters, in particular, older voters, who wouldn't vote for Bernie because of the socialist label. And there were voters who you would lose because of that. That is true. But
yeah, I think it was a minority.
It was mainly voters that Democrats would never win anyway. So,
exactly. Right.
Okay.
So I want to go to the last question, which is from Katie. Katie, where are you?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. So what I'm hearing a lot of from everybody and feeling inside myself a great deal now, especially after Roe versus Wade, is tremendous cynicism and despair, which we've talked about. My question is kind of back to what Mike's question was, what can we all do as we leave this discussion today to make a difference and even bring some inspiration to the collective psyche of all of us?
Look, I think what Bernie would say is keep fighting. And I think it's find things. I think the biggest difference we can all make right now is in our local communities in a lot of ways. And I think if you're looking for, we have to recognize that our fight, conservatives waged a 50-year fight against Roe. And a lot of our fights are going to be 50-year fights. A lot of what we're talking about, we aren't going to win in 2 years. And we cannot judge the strength or the success of how we are doing by the electoral swings of every 2 years that are outside of that, that our fights are going to be much longer, that one election, so we are in a place as a country that one electoral cycle isn't going to fix it. But that doesn't mean we give up. That means we recognize what Republicans and conservatives recognized in the 70s, which is overall, you can read their memos, and there are a few that are more kind of in pop culture than others, about strategy and other things. You can read a bunch of memos from the 1970s that conservatives wrote about taking back their country, and especially in the post-Nixon era, and also actually in the middle of Nixon as well. And we just have to, we have to recognize that our fight is just as long, and that we might not win in 2 years. We might not win in 4 years. We might not win in 10 years. But we are correct. Our ideology is right. What we believe is correct. And at some point we will win it, but that might not be, the hope is it might not be tomorrow. I have to say this. So after the opposition lost in Hungary, and I was in Hungary for that election, I took a few of my Hungarian friends, and there's a park. Have any of you been to Budapest?
I have.
Did you go to Memento Park?
I don't know that I have. I don't know the name of the parks I was in, so I don't know.
So Memento Park is a park about 30 minutes outside of Pest by car.
Oh, then I wasn't there.
And they took all the Soviet monuments from the city and they put them in one park on the outskirts of Buda. So Budapest is two cities, Buda and Pest, separated by the Danube. It's
Right.
governed as one city, but there are numerous districts in the city. Each district has a mayor, but there's Buda and Pest, two sides. But this park all the way out in Buda, where they took all the old Soviet monuments and they put them in one park. And you can go to this park and you can see these giant Soviet monuments that they moved here. And we went there the day after the election, and these were young people who had worked in the opposition and were very distraught about Orban winning again, which, look, you can't win. Winning a democratic election in a non-democratic country is not really something that's going to happen. But we went to this park and I said, this park makes me hopeful. And they said, what makes you hopeful about, how are you hopeful by this park? And I said, you look around this park and it is filled with giant monuments weighing 2 and 3 and 4 and probably 10 tons that were built by one of the two largest military, economic, and governing powers in the history of the world. And within 1 year, that entire system came crashing down, basically. That it was powerful, and but it took years of work. Yes, it took people years of work and years of effort and years of struggle in fighting for their freedoms in a place like Hungary to bring down that oppressive state. But within 1 year, the whole thing basically fell apart after decades of struggle by a lot of people who, by some people, it's interesting because there are people like Orban who are now on the wrong side, who were part of that struggle, who are now on the wrong side of that. But there are people in the opposition who are on the right side of that. And sorry, Orban was on the, fought communism and then went to the wrong side to gain power. There are people who are in the opposition who are on the other side of that. But the point is, our systems change, and even the most challenging and the strongest systems can collapse in on themselves in a very quick amount of time. But it takes years of activism to make that happen. And that's the hopeful note.
Yes, that is a hopeful note, or at least keep us going. I want to thank you, Ari. This has been so incredible this afternoon. I think every one of us have learned a lot about what the inner workings of our government and how things are. And though we can be discouraged, I think we also have to take a lesson from you and from Bernie, who just never stop, no matter what, and take the long view. So thank you, Ari, for being with us. I'll send you the recording tonight. And we all appreciate you so much.
Thank you. And if you can buy the book at your local bookstore, that would be great.
Here it is.
If you don't want to use things named after rainforests, buy it at your local bookstore.
And you could also get it, you can get it online. You can download it.
Yes.
Some people do that. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. The long-term approach.